Okay, so for chapter 13, we're going to focus on conflict. So conflict is a literary element that involves a struggle between two opposing forces. So two opposite forces. In literature, it's usually a protagonist, which is the main hero type character, and the antagonist, which is, in like fairy tales, it would be the villain. But in this case, it's anybody that goes against the protagonist. So we can think of it as like good versus evil, good versus bad. But more specifically, we have two types of conflict in literature. We have internal conflict, and this arises as soon as a character experiences two opposite emotions or desires. So virtue or vice, or good and evil inside of him. Or it can be simply like a very difficult decision to make, and trying to figure out if that's the right or wrong decision. So this disagreement within the self causes a character to suffer mental agony, and internal conflict develops as a unique tension in a storyline marked by a lack of action. So the character can't take action against themselves, obviously, but it's a struggle internally, so we see it come out in their emotions. Okay, we would call this conflict man versus self. External conflict is the other type of conflict in literature, and it is marked by characteristic involvement of an action through which the character is in a struggle against an outside force. So something is against. So we see this more visually. Internal conflict, we have to look very closely at the text, and we have to kind of read in between the lines. External conflict, we see very much so described. It drives the action in the text. So usually action is taken between the protagonist and whatever outside force he is fighting against. So we have man versus man, man versus nature. So that's if a story is about a character stuck outside somewhere, or there's a storm approaching. So that gets us into man versus nature. Or even if there's, dinosaurs or some type of animal, that all encompasses nature. And then man versus society, so that's if a man is fighting for values or is fighting against something that affects society at large or affects multiple different people, which we will see in To Kill a Mockingbird. Alright, so just to give you some conflicts that we've already seen so far, Scout has experienced a lot of man versus man, so external conflicts. So we have Scout versus Miss Caroline. When Miss Caroline didn't approve of Scout's ability to read and write, there was a conflict. Scout versus Walter Cunningham. Scout beat up Walter after she determined it was his fault. So Scout took action against Walter. And then we have Scout versus Calpurnia. Calpurnia in the beginning of the book. So chapter 3, Calpurnia punishes Scout, and this upsets Scout, so there is a tension between them. And then we have Scout versus Aunt Alexandra. This is more than just this example in chapter 9, but Scout versus Aunt Alexandra in a lot of ways when it comes to all the business about being a lady, and then Aunt Alexandra's perception on the world is so different than Scout's, so that causes tension between the two of them. And then, of course, Scout versus Cousin Francis. Cousin Francis insulted Atticus. Scout punches him in the face. So, a very clear conflict. Action was taken. Then we have Jem. Jem versus Mrs. Dubois. Since Jem is not our main character, we don't see a lot of conflict with him. But this one was a very clear conflict. Mrs. Dubois insults both Scout and Atticus, and so Jem destroys her plants, and then he, of course, has to pay a consequence for that, and that extends the conflict even further, because it takes him throughout that chapter to learn more about her and understand why she is the way she is. And then we do have Jem versus society as well. So as the novel goes on, and Jem is facing more and more of life's difficult realities, especially the racism in Maycomb, he has to figure out how to deal with and understand the prejudice in the town. So we want to pay attention as this conflict develops, because this is really going to develop in the second half of the novel where we are at now. Atticus Atticus's main conflict all revolves around this case with Tom Robinson. He's facing a lot, and so he is fighting against the racism and prejudice in that town. And it may be a losing battle, but it's still one that he is fighting. So it is him versus essentially the rest of the town. One of the main overarching conflicts in the novel is this idea of innocence versus evil. So now I'm not talking about, like, the devil and that kind of evil, but more the bad in human nature. So the childhood innocence that Scout and Jem begin the novel with is continuously threatened throughout the story. So they get little incidences in the beginning, like, Boo being locked up by his parents. That's an exposure to the evil side of human nature. Although in the beginning they're too innocent and immature to really recognize it. But as the story goes on and they are becoming more mature, they're going to start understanding things a little bit more deeply. So they're going to see they're going to be looking at the actual, like, evilness in these events instead of just viewing them as fact. They're going to think a little bit deeply. So, loss of innocence, we've talked about a little bit before, is a major theme in the novel. And this is a conflict. So this conflict, this loss of innocence and the way that it's being lost. So them seeing the bad things about the world they live in is causing their innocence to be lost. That's what we want to pay attention to as this story goes on. When the novel started, we were given a clear glimpse of Scout and Jem's innocence. So they played and acted out scenes from books and people's lives. It's very innocent. They're acting out Boo's life without really realizing how tragic his life is. So they're being portrayed as very childlike. But now that we're in the second part of the novel, in the harsher realities of the time period, specifically speaking of the racism and prejudice that is rampant in that town, these realities are setting in, and they have no other option but to face them and to try to understand them. But the only way that they can understand them is if that innocence is lost. So they will be affected by the actions that will take place that show the evil side of human nature. So from people taking action against somebody, against them, we're going to see a lot start to happen and build, and we really want to follow those ideas if we're going to get anything out of this book. Okay, so that is it for conflict. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this assignment. So for chapter 13, this video will go here in this spot, obviously, and then you need to read chapter 13. You can go to YouTube and search for the audiobook if you need it. Now, step 3. The question, there is one question, so it should be done in this same day, and it should be thoughtful. You're going to look at Atticus's internal conflict. So you're going to see what it is. You need to identify what the internal conflict is. So what he is battling with inside of himself, what causes that conflict. This response, as it says, should be 6 to 8 sentences. Now, I'm giving you 2 page numbers. These page numbers is the very end of the conflict. That's where the conflict is coming out. But that's not going to help you really identify what the conflict is. So on those 2 pages, it's Atticus and the kids are having a discussion. But you need to go back and look at what causes this end discussion. So you need to read more than just these 2 pages. It's important, guys, that we are doing more than the bare minimum now when we're at this point, because the school year isn't going to be getting easier. We need to break this habit of laziness. Okay? And as always, if you need help or have questions, you can ask me, but I'm going to expect that you have done the reading before you ask me questions, because if you ask me a question and I can tell that you haven't read the book, I'm going to tell you to read the book. All right? Good luck.